before Jason starts with his lecture, I will just have a short introduction about his work. So Jason is a professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Maine. His areas of scholarships are social and political philosophy, 19th and 20th century continental philosophy, critical theory, philosophy of history, and of course his favorite philosopher Spinoza. Jason published 3 books: The Micropolitics of Capital, Marx and the Prehistory of the Present in 2003, then The Politics of Trans-Individuality in 2015, and the very recent one, The Production of Subjectivity, Marx and Philosophy from 2022. And if I'm not wrong, he currently works on his 4th book, The Double Shift, Marx and Spinoza, on the ideology and politics of work. Jason's work was published in our parts of the world too. So journal Teoria koja hoda, the walking theory, published his paper, The Invitation of the Common, in 2016 in one of the issues of this journal. So you can read Jason in Cerebral Creation as well. The title of today's lecture and today's talk is Negative Solidarity as a Strategy from Adaption to Transformation. Jason, the floor or the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Hope you can hear everything okay? Okay. So let me just... So yes, the talk I'm going to give today is called Negative Solidarity as Strategy from Adaption to Transformation. And this is drawing some, not direct text, but some of the things I've been thinking about in the forthcoming book that was just referenced. So Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari argued that Spinoza's political question, why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were salvation, is still the fundamental question of political philosophy. As they state, citing Wilhelm Reich as well as Spinoza on this point, quote, the astonishing thing is not that some people steal or that others occasionally go on strike, but that all those who are starving do not steal as a regular practice, and those who are exploited are not continually on strike. This question, posed back in 1972 by Deleuze and Guattari, repeating Reich, repeating Spinoza, has only become more pressing in the last 30, 40, 50 years, depending on how you want to count it, as longer hours, precarious working conditions, and worse pay across the US and much of the world has become something that workers have adapted to rather than rebel against. Jennifer Silva, in Coming Up Short, Working Class Adulthood in an Age of Uncertainty, offers the beginning of response through an examination of the attitudes and affects of American workers. Silva sets out to examine precisely what happens to lives in the US caught in the post-2008 recession. These are the lives of primarily working class people caught up in debt with dwindling job prospects and often living with their parents, whose lives have been kind of interrupted in terms of the normal, progression of moving out of a home, starting a career, and so on and so forth. They've been not denied these promises and are in some sense mourning the slow decline of the Fordist or American dream. What Silva finds striking is a lack of any anger or political mobilization on the part of these who are left out of this dream. Being left out of the prospect of a steady job and linear career development does not entirely exclude one from the mythology, from the ideal of work and discipline. As Silva describes her general findings, at its core, the emerging working class adult self is characterized by low expectations of work, wariness toward romantic commitment, widespread distrust of social institutions, profound isolation from others, and an overriding focus on their emotions and psychic health. Rather than turn to politics to address these obstacles standing in the way of secure adult life, the majority of the men and women I interviewed crafted deeply personal coming-of-age stories, grounding their adult identities in recovering from their painful past, whether addiction, childhood abuse, family trauma, or abandonment, and forging an emancipated, transformed, and adult self. A few general conclusions stem from this claim, which sums up her findings. First, it underscores that the ideal of individual success through work was always itself socially produced. Work can only become a condition of individual advancement through institutional supports that reinforce the accumulation of wealth and status, while protecting one from contingencies such as injury or illness, what Robert Castell calls the social wage. However, the dismantling of the institutions that make work a vehicle of individual advancement does not lead to the dismantling of the work ethic, in part because the ideology of work never recognized its own social conditions or social framework. The ideal of the work ethic outlasts its social material conditions, conditions that connect this work to security and stability, because the work ethic, as an ethos, a way of conducting individual life, never really recognizes conditions. The demand to find meaning or purpose in work thus becomes even stronger as the material reward declines. As Silva argues, what remains is the ideal of work. Work unmoored from its material rewards become its own reward and justification. The subjects she interviews turn work inward, reframing the narratives of their lives in terms of past traumas and obstacles. They work, but only on themselves. The rewards for this work are found not in economic status, but what Silva refers to as their place in the mood economy. The fundamental currency of this mood economy is a prevailing attitude of self-reliance and independence, as the failure of social institutions, such as schools, unions, or the ability to navigate these institutions, is revalorized into an ideal of self-reliance and independence. The destruction of the conditions of individual success, what Castell calls negative individuality, becomes a kind of individualism, as failures to finish school, to successfully navigate the meager social safety net that is available, are transvalued into an ethic of independence. What matters more than material success or even a career is an ability to claim one's supposed independence. Independence becomes its own goal or end. This transformation can be understood to be a mutation of what could be called, following Frederic Lordon, the affective composition of labor. Lordon offers a history of how the economy can be understood as a fundamental reorganization of desires and affects. This history is mapped onto two axes. The first, drawn from Marx, is considered in terms of the division between production and consumption, the two separate spheres of activity. Within this, the division between abstract and concrete labor in terms of the productive side, or the generic imperative of productivity of the specific pleasures and constraints of this or that job, play a secondary role. The second axis, drawn from Spinoza, is that of joy of sadness, understood as an increase or decrease in one's power and capacity. From these two coordinates, it is possible to chart the history of capital. The first phase of this history corresponds to the initial formation of capitalism, what Marx called formal subsumption. The primary institutional basis for capitalism at this stage is the absence of any alternative to wage labor, the destruction of the commons, or any sustenance economy. The passion to be reckoned with at this stage of capital is fear, to paraphrase Hobbes, who, without perhaps meaning to, captured better than Spinoza the affective composition of primitive accumulation. Fear is a motive, a driving force, orienting the striving of individuals, but a limited one. People compelled by fear will work, but only as much as is necessary to stave off the punishments that they fear. Those who do not work do not eat, and as is fear of starvation or homelessness that keeps one working, fear is not only limited incentive, it is also a fundamentally unstable one. Fear can drive one to revolt almost as much as it can drive one to obey. From this, then, Lordon maps a second stage that roughly corresponds with Fordism. For Lordon, the institutional effect of Fordism is one of the destruction of the pleasures and pride of concrete labor, the pleasures of a particular skill in favor of a general shift of the desire for recognition or realization away from labor towards consumption. Ford's $5 day establishes an affective economy, exchanging sadness and frustration at work for the pleasures of the newly emergent consumer society. The final, or the most recent, change in this affective economy, at least according to Lordon, reorients pleasures towards work, but is no longer the pleasures of a particular skill, job, or result, but is the pleasure of employment itself. It is a desire that is, as much as possible, modeled on abstract labor. The modern ideal is, as much as possible, an indifference to the specific job, to model oneself in the image of abstract labor, For the elites, this ideal takes the form of professionalism and flexibility, while for those at the lowest level are cast out of work entirely, it takes the form of the discipline of the hustle or the idea that one must engage in some disciplined and productive activity. To describe this shift along the lines outlined by Laudon, we can see a new affective orientation, one sustained neither by consumption, which is increasingly too limited, reduced to basic necessities in an age of declining spending power to capture desire, or even production, as work becomes stripped not only of any joys, but any fantasies of mobility and accumulation. The failures of consumption or wage labor to offer any joys does not lead to their rejection. What emerges instead is an ideal of work as discipline and self-transformation becomes the source of validation. Work is unmoored from institutional condition to become an infinite task of self-transformation. Personal worth is found not through what one can buy or even what one can sell of oneself, but in one's sense of self-transformation or responsibility for one's own condition. It is the responsibility that matters, not the results or outcome. The focus on self-responsibility, of taking responsibility for overcoming all of one's hardships and traumas, entails a massive distrust of any collective or institutional solution, and a corresponding suspicion for those who engage in them. Pride in taking responsibility of one's own fate is an attempt to construct a joy, a positive condition out of a negative, sad affect. It is an attempt to make the difficulty of changing or altering one's condition itself into a source of pride or joy. It retrieves power and powerlessness by making one's condition, however impoverished, one's own responsibility. A similar affective composition can be found, or a similar analysis of the affective composition of labor can be found in David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs. While Graeber spends much of the book documenting and detailing the prevailing pointlessness of what he calls bullshit jobs, he also offers an explanation as to why this alienation from the meaning and purpose of work does not produce general disdain or rebellion. As Graeber writes, quote, "Workers, in other words, gain feelings of dignity and self-worth because they hate their jobs." Graeber's formulation inverts the classic definition of alienation, in which negative effects, loss of self, purpose, and activity, lead to a critical or negative relation to work. Rather, it is because one finds work to be painful, demeaning, and or difficult that one is attached to it, finds its justification in and through its difficulty. The difficulty of work becomes an attachment to that difficulty. The demeaning or taxing dimension becomes itself a point of pride. It is an inversion of the basic Spinoza's principle that one endeavors to imagine things that increase one's joy and capacity, or more precisely, it is an attempt to imagine one's suffering and incapacity to transform it into a kind of joy or pride, converting it to pleasure. Such a transformation of sadness into joy, passivity, and activity has its necessary condition, the sense of being completely overpowered and overwhelmed by one's conditions. The sense of being incapable of changing one's conditions can be real or imagined, because, as Spinoza argues, the imagination of being powerlessness is the same as being actually powerlessness, because, to quote Spinoza, whatever one imagines he cannot do, he necessarily imagines. And he is so disposed by this imagination that he really cannot do what he imagines he cannot do, end of quote. Such an imagination has very real effects, not only in terms of how one conducts their own life, but in how they imagine the conduct of others. As Graeber argues, those who take pride in their work because it is difficult are necessarily angry at not only those who are believed not to work, but also to those whose work is not deemed sufficiently difficult or demanding. In recent years in U.S. politics, teachers and teachers' unions have been held as particular targets of contempt for both their job protections as a unionized workforce, the supposed ease of their job, summers off, and also the fact that their job is perceived to be rewarding. This was summed up in an attempt to identify teachers and other public service workers with the figure of the quote-unquote welfare queen. Joy, or the imagined joy of others, becomes the source of resentment. The pride that one takes in one's work is inseparable from the anger and jealousy that one has towards others, towards what one imagines as their their life of pleasure or ease. The attachments to responsibility, to a sense of worth found in work, are strategies for coping with declining prospects for improved material conditions for the pleasures of consumer society. They are remnants, often images of bygone conditions and decaying dreams. They are the work ethic when it is stripped not only of its religious sense, but also its connection to even worldly rewards of consumption and security. What we increasingly see in austerity is a revival of the oldest myth and legends of capital and capitalist accumulation against its material reality. Work is said in many senses. The term is used to refer to the exchange of labor for a wage, but is also refused to any activity that requires effort and focus, wage or unwaged, such as housework or homework. It is often used to valorize any effort in any activity, as in the often repeated saying, at least in English, relationships are work. These different senses of work coexist, compete, and contradict in the conflict between different senses and sensibilities. Within this conflict, it's possible to say that there is a dominant sense or sensibility. This dominant sense of work is not just the valorization of wage work over and against the unwaged work, the work that cares for and reproduces social relations and the care of children, the elderly, and so on, but is also work understood in terms of an ethical value that is framed not only by its fundamental difficulty, but by the fact that it is hated or endured. Work, especially that is understood as a real job, which is to say coded as productivist, masculine, and often white, is understood to be the source of at least symbolic value, even as its market value declines. The symbolic value intersects with other symbols of hierarchy and exclusions. As Daniel Martinez Hosang and Joseph E. Lowndes argue, productivism, the valorization of supposed real workers, does not correspond to any actual division of the economy or any specific job. It does not just exclude those who work in the public sector, even services, but also industries such as textiles, meat processing, or electronics assemblies, productive industries that tend to be dominated, at least in the US, as well as globally, by women and people of color. Productivism is not only coded specifically male and white, but this sense of male and whiteness is defined in part through the particular laboring conditions that make difficulty into a point of pride. As Hosang and Lowndes write, within a cultural discourse and policy framework that fetishizes and naturalizes market forces, anyone perceived to have job security, wages or benefits, or even the most basic forms of autonomy and authority at work can stand accused of violating the ethical norms of producerism. And as the sectors of the economy long associated with producerism continue to shrink, the protections of claims to a producerist identity will also wither. Producerism, the particular work ethic that turns difficulty into a virtue, can thus be understood not only as a particular affective composition of labor, one that makes its difficulty into a point of pride, turning sadness into joy. It is also a particular inadequate idea or universal in Spinoza's sense, one that takes particular aspects of labor, particular experiences, such as the difficulty and the idea of producing something rather than working with others, and constructs from this an imaginary universal. The universal is constructed from multiple and shifting senses and sensibilities of work, economic, cultural, and political. As tenuous as this image of the real worker is, its hegemony is reflected and reinforced every time the image of men wearing hard hats are used to stand in for real workers, and the production of things is taken as synonymous with work itself. This is why you get, say, for example, in the US, a huge identification with the idea that coal mining is the essential job to save, because in some sense that job is, even as its economic importance dwindles in favor of other forms of energy production, its symbolic importance becomes even more valorized in the sense that it appears to be the real kind of work, the work that real people do as a real job and must in some sense be protected or valorized. In a post in the blog Splintering Bone Ashes, Alex Williams has dubbed this particular hostility towards workers who are imagined to be better off materially or even affectively, as in the case of teachers who are just imagined to enjoy their work more. He calls this negative solidarity. Negative solidarity is defined as, quote, an aggressively enraged sense of injustice, committed to the idea that because I must endure increasingly austere working conditions, wage freezes, loss of benefits, declining pension funds, erasure of job security, and increasing precarity, then anyone else must too. This shift is as much a shift of the representation or image of capital as it is a shift of the affective and imaginative composition of labor. As Yves Citon argues, this is a shift that affects both sides of the class division, attenuating the fundamental antagonism of class conflict. The term attenuation is useful here because, as the term suggests, it is not that class struggle has disappeared. The conflict over exploitation remains as that now hidden, now open fight, but has been diluted as the institutional articulation, the forces and languages to express it, have been effectively undermined. This attenuation is a transformation of both institutions and bodies and imaginations and concepts, of the order and connection of both as practices and representations intersect and transform each other. The individuation and isolation of the worker not only undermines the collective character of class struggle, it fundamentally alters what it means to be a worker. Gone is the opposition and antagonism that has been attached to the figure of the worker throughout the Marxist tradition, in which the worker was the expression of class conflict and class struggle. The worker now does not struggle collectively, but adapts individually, seeking to make his or her relative powerlessness as a seller of commodity into a source of power and pride. Flexibility, independence, and self-reliance become the defining characteristics of the worker, defining a new ethic and ideal of work. The transformation of the status of the worker does not leave the capitalist unaffected. As work loses its antagonistic sensibility, it becomes reappropriated by the capitalist as an ethical norm. The capitalist increasingly presents him or herself as a worker, as one whose activity, as in the case of management, is now seen as the true source of corporate wealth and accumulation. I mean, the culmination of this transformation of the sense and sensibility of work, at least in the English-speaking world, has been the phrase job creator, which is used to describe the capitalist. The capitalist is no longer someone who is dependent upon the worker for their wealth or their place in the economy, but has actually been completely inverted. They are now the person whose activity, whose ability to manage, to function as a CEO, actually creates jobs almost ex nihilo. This transformation has its structural and symbolic condition. Structurally, it is related to both the general condition of capital, in which even the boss is subordinated to demands of capitalist accumulation, in some sense becoming the bearer of this abstract formulation. But more specifically, it refers to contemporary transformations that focus on short fluctuations of stock prices over long-term profitability. These structural conditions are matched by a general transformation of the image and idea of the capitalist. The capitalist is increasingly seen not as opposed to the worker, but as the shrewdest and most dedicated worker. This transformation comes with an entire aesthetic, as hoodies replace suits, in the case of Silicon Valley CEOs, and pickup trucks replace town cars in the case of its more rural variations. As Etienne Balibar sums up both sides of this transformation, the capitalist is defined as a worker, as an entrepreneur, the worker as the bearer of a human capacity of human capital. This inverted world, like Marx's famous reference to the camera obscura, is itself a product of material and ideological conditions. The individuation and isolation of work makes advancement and success less a collective or political goal than an individual investment in human capital. While on the other side, the fetishization of capitalism, the effacement of the institutional political conditions of capitalist accumulation, leads to the image of the capitalist as one who acquires wealth by working harder or smarter. The attenuation of the conflict does not dissipate the conflict itself. conflict still structures the fundamental economic relation. This relation is in part determined by the nature of labor power as a unique commodity. As with any other commodity, the buyer wants to get as much work as possible for as little money as possible, and the seller wants to get as much money for their work, which in this case encompasses their very body and mind that they are selling. At the same time, this commodity, labor power, is unlike any other commodity in that it's inseparable from the body and mind of the workers selling it. It is for this reason that as much as class struggle can be attenuated, can be diffused by institutions that treat workers as entrepreneurs, developing their human capital, and representations of capitalists as true men of the people, it cannot be destroyed. The conflict over time in the body cannot be completely obscured. Its fundamental corporeal and affective basis, the combination of exhaustion, pride, anger, and frustration, cannot be destroyed. However, it can be reoriented, focused on different objects and relations. The attenuation of class struggle, its dissipation into a conflict in which there are no classes and no structural conditions, but only individuals engaged in competition and investment in human capital, does not dispense with these affects. Instead, it makes possible for them to take on different topics and different objects. As Citon writes, the fear of falling down the social ladder that feeds into much of the success of xenophobic parties is undoubtedly fostered by political rhetoric and media agendas that win over their audiences by playing on their fears, either cynically or naively. But however misleading it may be to see the danger as arising from the figure of the stranger, the feeling of insecurity, which explains the anxieties of social decline, stems as much from concrete realities, increasing inequalities, geoeconomic adjustments, ecological unsustainability, as from media boogeymen, the flood of migrants, or resurgent Islam. That's Yves Citon. As Spinoza argues, inadequate ideas follow the same necessity as adequate ideas. The distortions and deviations that turn worker against worker along the lines of race and nation are themselves the product of material and affective conditions generated through the economy while not being reducible to them. These affects could be organized in different directions, become part of different myths or different understandings, different conceptualizations, such as that of class struggle, but they are irreducible, which is to say they cannot be simply dispensed with or made to disappear. This is why an attenuation of class struggle, especially in an era of increased insecurity and job pressures, must necessarily involve the acceleration of other sorts of conflict. Negative solidarity is what remains of class conflict after drink of water real fast. Negative solidarity is what remains of class conflict after class conflict has been attenuated. Negative solidarity is a particular sense of indignation aimed not at capitalists for living off the exploitation of labor, but at those who are seen either to not work or those whose work fails to live up to the norms and demands of truly productive labor. Alexander Metteron argues that indignation has particular importance in Spinoza's understanding of the political life of the affects. As Spinoza argues in the political treatise, affects are central to the organization of political life. A people are constituted by common affect or common sensibility. As Spinoza writes, quote, "Since men, as we have said, are led more by passion than by reason, it naturally follows that a people will unite and consent to be guided as if by one mind, not at reason's prompting, but through some common emotion such as common hope or common fear or a desire to avenge some common injury." In other words, it is a matter of common indignation. Spinoza defines indignation as the hate we feel for those who do evil to a being that resembles us. This affect is immediately social or doubly social because even before it is a shared affect, finding a particular collectivity, it is social in its very genesis, since it involves not only others, the one who does evil and the one who it is done to, but also an imagination of others and their resemblance to us. It also relates to a fundamental ambiguity at the heart of social life, the intersection of imagination and reason. Indignation is a foundation of politics, not just because it involves a relation with others, but because it attests to the need for a common rule or standard of collective life. It is not a sadness or joy that directly relates to the one who experiences it, but to someone else. It is how we experience the social nature of our own affects. Indignation is one of the corollaries of the fundamental proposition regarding the imitation of affects, a proposition that shapes collective life as much as individual life. Just as our affects are always already social, collective life is founded on affects as much as reason. As much as indignation attests to and even prefigures our shared social life and the need for rules of common existence, it does so only through an effect that is fundamentally unstable. Indignation could easily turn to envy, but also through the imagination. Spinoza's development of the social nature of the imitation of the affects proceeds from a specific relation, a specific person who is harmed or aided by others, to a general idea or norm for humanity. As Spinoza argues, we strive to do whatever we imagine men to look on with joy, and we are averse to doing what men are adverse to do, end quote. Our affects and conduct are shaped by the affects and conduct of others. The image we form is less an image of a specific person that has been aided or harmed than a universal idea of human beings in general. We act in accordance with what we think others in general would want or desire. These two aspects, actual utility, the need for common rules and standards, and imaginary resemblance, the sense that another is like us or resembles us, can coincide in a shared sentiment and understanding of justice, as our rational understanding of the utility of society and our imagination of the other coincide. They can also come into contradiction, as our sense of indignation is limited to who we perceive to resemble us. As Balibar writes, quote, sociability is therefore the unity of real agreement and imaginary ambivalence, both of which have real effects. As Balibar argues, real agreement is predicated on difference. We are useful to each other insofar as we are different, while imaginary ambivalence is predicated on an imagined similarity that shapes ambition, sympathy, and indignation. The ambiguity at the center of social life is split between reason and imagination, idea and affect, but also difference and identity. As Spinoza argues, nothing is more useful to man than man, but this use is predicated on difference, on different strivings and different characters, or what Spinoza calls ingenium. The rational foundation of society reorganizes the utility of difference. A city made up of one type, whether it be sages, philosophers, artists, plumbers, or electricians, would collapse, unable to meet the myriad and different needs of human beings. This idea of a society defined by useful difference comes into conflict with another ideal, another foundation of society, that of a fundamental equality or universality of a common humanity. The effects that shape our political life, indignation, emulation, ambition, are shaped by the particular image we have of humanity split between difference and universality. Political conflict is often a conflict between different particulars that shape the universal. It is possible to argue that rational utility is found at the level of the economy, while imaginary identification is found at the level of politics, as Balibar does, as Balibar writes. It would be easy to conclude that Marx is basically unaware of the other scene of politics, the scene of communitary affiliation, and therefore unaware of symbolic violence as well. Though he names it or has bequeathed us with the word ideology, one of the aptest names for it, and to conclude that Spinoza, for his part, basically ignores the irreducible level of economic antagonism, doubtless because at the economic level, where can perhaps be conceived as a productive force, Spinoza is basically an optimist and a utilitarian. As much as it would be possible to argue that the economy is the realm of utility and politics that of symbolic identification and violence, such a division fails to account for not only the thought of Marx and Spinoza, but more importantly, the actual relations of politics and economics. With respect to Marx, capitalism cannot be identified simply with the economy, but with an entire transformation of the symbolic order. The persistent force of this transformation is the commodification of labor power, which negates differences of gender and ethnicity in the interchangeability of abstract labor. However, this is only one side of the labor relation. At the same time, there is concrete labor, the specific tasks and endeavors that define different jobs and activities. The first is associated with universality, with the after image of equality that accompanies abstract labor. The latter, that which accompanies concrete labor, is an image not only of difference, but of hierarchy, of different jobs and the different skills and abilities that correspond to those different jobs. The imaginary of concrete and abstract labor is also split between particularity and universality, hierarchy and equality. The image of the economic collective is defined by both difference, by the fact that others must be doing different things for me in order for society to function, and identity, that in some sense these different things must all be understood as work, have something in common as a shared task or endeavor, despite their differences, in order to be exchangeable. Thus, any attempt to imagine humanity around work as workers is subject to its own divisions and exclusions. These divisions take on increasing importance as the conflict between worker and capitalist are increasingly attenuated by the generalized imperative for everyone to be a worker or to see themselves in work. Work becomes the terrain of conflicts shaped by the imaginary of what is considered to be real work. The new exclusions pass between those who are perceived to work and those who are perceived not to work. And of course, we can talk about the way in which all racial and ethnic stereotypes are usually accompanied by an idea of not really working or of not really engaging in work the right way and the proper way. And this also includes, especially in the US version, the way in which workers in the public sector, which remain to be some of the only unionized jobs, such as those as teachers, are seen to some sense fail to really work because the collective nature of their guarantees and so on protects them from the supposed individual and individualizing sort of self-discipline that supposedly defines work. Work itself is a site of symbolic exclusion and exclusion. Negative solidarity can be understood as a particular affect, indignation at those who are perceived to not work hard enough or not engage in real work, or who rely on political power or corruption. And these two things, I think, are increasingly seen as synonymous to keep their jobs. This affect, this anger aimed at everyone from those who benefit from the last remnants of social protection in terms of unemployment payments to those public employees who still have union protections, has to be seen as both an exclusion and an exclusion. As much as exclude those who do not work or who are not perceived as working, it does so in the name of a loose collectivity. A popular bumper sticker in the US reads, "Keep working, millions of welfare depend upon you," defining a particular kind of indignation. The person affixing such a bumper sticker to their car is not just angry at the person who is supposedly living off of their labor, although it's worth pointing out here how much quote unquote welfare or aid to families with dependent children has been increasingly cut under austerity since the Clinton administration. So it doesn't really exist in the way that it's supposedly to imagine to exist. But anyways, the person affixing such a bumper sticker to their car is angry not just at the person who is supposedly living off of their labor, but as it addresses or interpolates its imagined audience, it draws them together in shared indignation. There is a sense of we, a collectivity of real workers, real Americans, an imagined universality, albeit a weak and fragile one, defined by both work as a condition of belonging and indignation at those who are perceived to undermine it. This is what puts the solidarity in negative solidarity. There is a unity, a community, albeit loosely defined, in and through their shared engagement in work, in productive work, work that is defined through both its physical difficulty, or at least the stoic fortitude it takes to endure it, its economic centrality, or perceived economic extrality, and an ethic of individual commitment rather than collective protections. The solidarity is negative in the sense that it both eschews any collectivity. Unions are seen as a deviation rather than the expression of this collectivity, precisely because they undermine the shared commitment to work that it defines it, and the way that it functions as strategy. Negative solidarity can only see any improvement of working conditions, collective bargaining, protection of employment, and so on, as not only partial and then in some sense corrupt, but also as a deviation from the fundamental ethical basis of work itself, which demands individual strength and fortitude. As much as negative solidarity is aimed at others, at those who are perceived to not work, seeking to discipline those who rely on state spending or those who are protected by union agreements, it ultimately furthers the attenuation of class struggle, obscuring actual divisions, the division of class struggle, with imagined divisions framed around the ethical value of work. The attachment to work and independence ultimately undermines its own status in the world as individual workers are left to fend for themselves. Negative solidarity is an affect, a particular sense of indignation and imagination, a particular understanding both the limits and possibilities of the economy and politics, as well as the place of the individual in each, and a particular strategy, what could be considered a losing strategy, a strategy that reflects defeat in politics and in social life, and perpetuates that defeat through an attachment to work. It is a foundational cruel optimism. It is a strategy that embraces neither politics, especially as electoral politics has been a source of not only disappointment and indignation, nor does it act collectively with respect to the economy. There is nothing to be done against the natural economic order, or an economic order, I should say, is perceived as natural. Acting in terms of the economy not only comes against unchangeable laws, but risks negative effects, as in the often heard belief that increased wages will only lead to automation or outsourcing. Such a strategy acts only on itself, only seeks to work harder, to adapt and hopefully anticipate the fluctuating demands of capital. It is a strategy shaped by loss, by the attenuation of class struggle, and furthermore, one that can only lose, replacing collective struggle with individual adaptation to conditions that can only further undermine that of workers. Okay, now to the conclusion. The fundamental political question left by negative solidarity is how to transform it. How to shift the feeling of solidarity from that of a weak connection around the shared necessity of work to an actual solidarity of workers, one that does not divide between quote unquote real workers and non-workers, but is predicated on the shared role in social production and reproduction. A transformation of negative solidarity is not an overcoming of the basic affects that structure it, the fear, insecurity, and frustration, but a reorientation of these fundamental affects, shifting them from the imagined specter of immigration and automation towards the exploitation that is at the heart of the capitalist mode of production. The fundamental difficulty that such a transformation faces is that capital appears less and less an institution and more a natural phenomena, the way of the world. As Marx argues, the working class in capital increasingly understands capital itself as functioning according to self-evident natural laws. This representation of necessity has an affective dimension as well. First, because as Spinoza argues, we love or hate something more if we imagine it free than we imagine it to be necessary. To which Spinoza adds that since we consider ourselves and other humans to be free, we feel love or hatred stronger towards them. As Spinoza writes, love toward a thing will be greater if we imagine it to be free than if we imagine it to be necessary, and similarly for hate. We largely consider the human world, the world of other people and their actions, to be more worthy of anger and love than the natural world, because the former is seen as contingent while the latter is understood to be necessary. It is foolish to get angry at the weather. To which we could add the following assertion from Marx, that the more the economy is perceived as itself a kind of nature or second nature, obeying its laws which are outside of human action or intervention, the less it is subject to the same affects, the same love or hatred. As Marx writes, to quote the passage I was referring to earlier, the advance of capitalist production develops a working class which by education, tradition, and habit looks upon the requirements of that mode of production as self-evident natural laws. This perspective, seeing the requirements as self-evident natural laws, does not just efface history and change, as Marx stressed, but also, as Spinoza would emphasize, includes an affective dimension. The more the capitalist mode of production is perceived as necessary, as functioning according to its laws, the less it makes sense to become angry or indignant at its actions. The more it just becomes the way of the world, and what are you going to do? There's a second dimension, a second intersection of affect and modality. As Spinoza also writes, an affect towards a thing we imagine is necessary is more intense, other things being equal, than one towards a thing we imagine is possible or contingent or not necessary. The contradiction here is only an apparent one. Anger and joy are stronger given the idea of freedom, the idea that things could be done otherwise. But overall, the more necessary something is seen, the stronger the effect will be because it is seen as unavoidable. Those things that are perceived as imminent and unavoidable generate more fear than anything perceived to be contingent or possible. The perception or imagination of necessity or freedom have their different affective dimensions. The former are more intense because they're seen as certain, while the contingency of the latter elicits more love or anger because it could have been otherwise. On this reading, it is possible to comprehend a division between economics and politics predicated on affect. The reason why politicians invite such indignation, such anger, is precisely because they are perceived to be free. They could have acted otherwise or could have enacted different policies. The same is not true of economic actions, the actions of the market, or even its representatives in the form as heads of corporations, which are seen to be conforming to necessity, the demands of productivity, the demands of market dictates, and so on. One could even argue that in capitalism countries today, one of the primary functions of politicians is often to act as scapegoats for economic processes. Politicians promise to create jobs, to improve economic conditions, something that they can only act on in limited or indirect ways, but their main function is not so much to affect these changes, but to be the rotating figures of hope, fear, and eventually indignation. We must see the necessity underlying the actions of politicians, which is the same as recognizing that no politician, no electoral politics can save us, while at the same time recognizing the contingency of the economic order, the necessities of capitalism, the demands to get a job, to keep the economy expanding, are contingent products of particular social relations. Shifting our anxieties and fears from each other as a source of competition and threat and so on with respect to work to capital, shifting our indignation from politicians to capital is a matter of shifting our imagination. As such, it entails a transformation of the positive as well as negative affects of hopes and fears. Such transformation is difficult. Our desires are shaped by this world. It's hard to imagine otherwise. While we work, we not only make and remake the world, but we make and remake ourselves as workers, reorienting our desires and imagination. Work and attachment to work is both what holds current capitalism together at the level of imagination and ideology, and what perpetually risks unraveling at the level of affects and reality. Perhaps the linchpin that ties us to capital, perhaps it is the linchpin that ties us to capital that is also the key to its transformation. The seeds of a new world are already there, and the frustrations and exhaustion that we confront daily in work, it is only a matter of letting them grow, letting them expand, and ultimately shifting how we think of them, how we feel them, to frustrations with other workers or frustrations with those who are perceived to not work, to ultimately becoming indignation at the thing that is the source of our exploitation and suffering, and that is the institution of capitalism itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, very much. Thank you for your talk. I think you open many critical points, not just from the perspective of the global left, but obviously from different disciplines. And I saw your lecture and your work as a part of wider transdisciplinary interests or transdisciplinary bibliography that deals with work beyond the centrality of wage labor, which was the central illustration of the work for many decades. Especially me coming from another background, especially from the point of view of global history and history of labor, where this type of work really made major interest in last few decades. I would say different authors, especially from the global south, are trying to put another perspectives and maybe gather all the plurality of the work forms, including socially productive work, but also migrant labor, subsistence labor, etc. My question, I will use my position as a moderator to ask the first question. Maybe to go a bit further back to your talk. In the beginning, your major references were Jennifer Silva and David Graeber, and basically you tried to make references to specific, let's call it, historical moment of the post 2008 austerity conditions, especially in the USA, but also globally. And I think you also mentioned in very illustrative terms the decline or even the death of the American dream in terms of the promise that especially younger generations could not fulfill in this period after the 2008 austerity. So this is the framework in which my generation as well found itself in terms of our position in the labor market and capitalism, and obviously it had affected us in many ways, especially our health and our. I think you mentioned that in some other of your texts that now the workers are more and more using the terms of emotions and affections when they talk about their individual position than in terms of economy, production, etc. So I wanted just to ask you a question. So this was the framework of 2008 and austerity, and the let's call it the wider decline of the welfare state. Mm-hmm. But to put these references and to put your theory in the context of maybe post 2020 situation, mm-hmm. In references to the big quit, to obvious wave of some kind of unionization in the USA mm-hmm. at the moment regarding the platform workers, the gig workers. So basically, my question to finish is, your point was that the 2008 and the post-austerity period and made a negative impact on the mobilization of the workers. But how to think about how to reflect this in the context of the post-COVID big quit and essential workers obviously are also important parts of this right. context.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that and it's hard to it's always hard to historicize your own.
Of course.
And there's been a kind of shifting. I mean, if you look at what has been written, what's been said about work in the COVID period, there was first it was sort of dismal because there were these. When at least in the U.S. context, when the first lockdowns happened and lots of businesses, especially things like restaurants, bars, etc., that a lot of people rely on for their work were closed. There was a push, a demand to reopen, that people wanted to return to work. But I think that was it was always kind of unclear, with this shift coming from the side of the workers or from the side of the consumers, the people who wanted to actually not so much work at these places, but wanted to be able to pay for that labor and enjoy things like going out to a meal or whatever. And then there was this entire talk of kind of the Great Resignation, and there was on top of that an increased awareness. I mean, suddenly people who found their work, because the term essential worker was an incredibly broad term that accompanied everything from people, driving ambulances and working in emergency rooms on one extreme, but it also included, people doing much more sort of much more devalued kind of work, like the kind of people who would restock shelves in grocery stores and keep supplies of food and other necessities moving. And so, suddenly people whose work was looked down upon because it was considered low skilled, low paid, etc., were suddenly told, you're essential. And in some sense, that essentiality, sometimes it came with, increased pay, but it often came with it was a symbolic recognition, yay, essential workers, but it included actually being exposed to, especially in the early year of the pandemic, pre-development of any vaccines, it included being exposed to the disease, to the disease and possibly death and possibly sickness. So it was a strange disjunct of both symbolic celebration and material risk and deprivation. But it did, I think, create and transform. I mean, what we've seen at least in the U.S. context with, the successful organizing of an Amazon distribution site and other forms, it has created a break from um, this kind of overarching sort of mythology around work that I was referring to, because one of the things I think is quite striking about both Silva's analysis, which is much more nuanced and textured in the sense that what she finds is people who are really deprived the ability to develop this kind of linear progression through work. What they do is they make their lives in some weird sense a work and celebrate their own individual discipline, even if their individual discipline doesn't get them any material rewards or change in their circumstance, right? So that the idea of I never relied on anyone becomes a point of pride. And I think one of the things that has really done the most to fracture that kind of ideology or that kind of imaginary has been the strange acknowledgement of a of the fact that we all depend upon each other. That was what the essential worker sort of idea sort of contained on some level. And I think it's interesting to see, at least in the US context, how quickly the government moved to kind of really shut that down, to shut down all the increased pay that came in the early stages of the pandemic, and to as quickly as possible, and that's what we're living in right now, a very much enforced return to normal, which is going to great efforts to make it appear as if the pandemic is over, as if these jobs no longer have their function as essential workers. They're just jobs again. And it really is an attempt to, as much as possible, resume work as normal. And of course, it remains to be seen, I think, in important ways, as we see this kind of these movements of almost wildcat organizing that isn't happening through a recognized union, as in the case of the Amazon, but also in the case of Starbucks and so on. As this movement moves, how much this is shaped by going through COVID, which I think has been a transformative experience for many people, especially younger people entering work, and how much is able to fight back against both the material deprivation of work, but also I think the deprivation of a kind of imaginary or vocabulary to think about work and talk about work outside of its highly individualistic and highly sort of disciplinary sort of way.
Okay, thank you. I will now open the floor for other members of our audience to ask Jason a question. Of course, there is I forgot to mention that there is always an option if you want to write a question in the chat box. That's also an option. I will read it for our Facebook audience. But yeah, the other options, of course, you just raise your hand and I will give you the mic if you have any question. Okay, we will wait a bit more, but I will use this. So I will give you an opportunity to prepare your question by making another point and continue this interview with Jason. So the first references, of course, when we talk about the work ethics, which was important part of your especially you mentioned earlier, this individualistic ideology of work ethics. So the first references is always the Protestant ethics. So I wanted to ask you, and you mentioned this, you opened this maybe, or you illustrated this issue with these stickers in the United States on that are related to indignation towards unionized workers. So this is far-fetching theory or far-fetching comment, but you can always, of course, say that I'm wrong. How is Southern Protestant denominations and Southern Protestant ideology of American evangelicals related to this indignation towards unionized workers, towards, of course, migrant workers, and also towards themselves, because they're obviously not excluded from the capitalist system, being the members of the Southern Baptist Bible Belt denominations. And obviously, if maybe I'm wrong, but when I look at the USA, this let's call it part of the population is maybe one that expressed this indignation in the most vocal way, embracing the very libertarian kind of ideology, also work ethics related to obviously some deeper ideological layers that I mentioned earlier with Protestant denominations and Protestant ethics. So just comment about this.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, you're definitely correct in saying that the sort of parts of the U.S. that are heavily dominated by forms of Protestantism, Southern Baptism, and so on, are also probably correspond pretty accurately with quote unquote right to work states, and other strong anti-union. I guess I'm not sure if I'd want to conclude that that's a direct expression of the Protestant ethic, because I feel like the Protestant ethic, I mean, as people like Kathy Weeks have argued in her book, The Problem with Work, that it has undergone several mutations in from its initial formulation up to the present. And as she talks about those mutations, or those antinomies, as she puts it, I think one of the most important antinomies, and this is sort of what I was partly getting at, is almost the reversal of the relationship between work as an economic activity and work as an ethical activity, right? And by ethical activity, I almost mean not so much the Protestant sense, but like Hegel's sense in the philosophy of right, when he talks about how work, it sands off the rough edges of particularity. It makes it possible for you to feel like you're owed something, you're contributing something. It gives you the status as a kind of person who is both worthy of respect and can be recognized as a worker. And of course, I mean, Hegel saw that there was, and this is one of the most interesting, as it's been written about. A lot of people talked about the figure of the rabble in Hegel. That Hegel, recognized there was a kind of ticking time bomb at the center of capitalist society between the ethical dimension of work and the economic dimension of work, right? Because when you begin to produce, and Hegel was aware of this, when you begin to produce unemployment, when you begin to automate people out of jobs and so on, you're stuck with this problem. You can either give them things without work, so you can either give them the economic benefits without the ethical benefit of work, and that's a problem because they won't really be full members of society. Or you can give them work, but that has a problem too, because if you give them work, what kind of work are they going to do? Are they going to put other workers out of work? So you're stuck in this sort of problem that you both want the economic and the ethical to cohere, but they don't always cohere, right? And what we see in the modern sort of solution to this is almost an immense attachment to the ethical dimension above the economic dimension. In other words, it is more important that you have a job than what that job does. And that having a job, and especially having a job that is seen as, quote unquote, real work, and although real work is an incredibly ambiguous and amorphous term that is, overdetermined by all kinds of logics of race, gender, and so on and so forth, but that having a job is seen as more important than the economic benefit. And part of this issue is, and this is, probably what I was trying to talk about, is that there is almost a self-defeating logic in that, because if work is supposed to be, by definition, something that is endured kind of stoically through its difficulty and is seen as ethically meaningful because it it is difficult, then that means that through your own work, you cannot organize with other workers. It has to be an isolating experience as well. So I guess what I'm saying is there's an overlap there between the way that work is viewed in this version to the way that society or individuals are viewed in general. So you have both the idea that individuals should turn to work, and you have the idea that individuals should only look to themselves or at best their family for support, and that any other form of organized material support is by definition ethically suspect and politically suspect as well.
Again, our audience is free to ask questions or have any kind of comments. Of course, you can also maybe relate Jason's lecture and talks and points to our situation, obviously similar to United States, but with specific differences, being the part of the sub-periphery of the global capitalism, and also country with a post-socialist and socialist history that had, I would say, different kind of conceptualization of the work, also institutionalization of the work, especially in the period of socialism. Of course, that's also interesting question to see, maybe comparison between these two situations. I think that our audience is very quiet. Yeah, it's a bit late here. It's almost. Yeah. Oh, there is one.
Yeah.
Martin.
Yeah, maybe something along the lines of what you mentioned as the naturalization of capital. And I mean, that is certainly a necessary first level intervention to explain that economics are not natural, or rather that they are man-made. But maybe that argument is more oriented towards the neoclassical economics and its ideological incursions into the mainstream consciousness. It seems that workers, with the benefit of living through a historical experience of a changing economic landscape, might not be too stuck on that point. Rather, that a different term might come in play, and that would be moral economy. This term by E.P. Thompson, or if we want to reach all the way to Marx, then we can call into play the term of a historical and moral standard. And then the perceived transgressions of that moral standard are something that can motivate political workers' action, because obviously you will not get angry at the weather, but it seems that if people understand that there is a historic and moral standard, and I think they do, they can be indignant in relation to that. And maybe that term and that phenomenon opens up more venues for thinking about political workers' action and such.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I think about, when in terms of the moral economy, is that there's a certain sense in which, I mean, the division I was sort of mapping out was, kind of a rough and heuristic one of the idea that, that the split between economics and politics is in some sense a split between, the realm in which people are seen to be able to, politicians are seen to be able to do more, and that's why they elicit more anger or elicit more hope. Whereas in economics, one is perceived to be able to do less. But I do feel like that division, it needs to be sort of complicated and problematized, because there's a shifting nature of it. I mean, I think the more that I think what we're seeing right now is an increased tendency, and it has, I think, something to do with what I was trying to talk about in terms of the capitalists presenting themselves as worker. And with that, of course, because when a capitalist presents themselves as a worker, they have to, of course, to justify the immense amount of money they take in and so on, they have to be the cleverest, smartest, most accomplished worker of them all. And the more the capitalist takes center stage and becomes kind of a public figure the more they risk losing the sort of impersonality and necessity that accompany being able to refer to the forces of the market as impersonal forces, and the more they become figures of both, in some sense, popular claim, but popular derision. I mean, if you look at what's happening, and forgive me for the very, U.S. centric nature of a lot of my examples, but these are the things I know. But if you look at what's happening with Elon Musk right now, who in some sense, for some people, he is almost this like figure of capitalist innovation personified. But the more he kind of makes mistakes, the more he elicits kind of a demonization and a fear, because it really ends up producing the realization for some people that maybe the power and influence these people have is not stem from their individual qualities, skills, and abilities, but stems precisely from the fact that they're positioned when they were born, inheriting a South African mineral fortune and so on, produces an ability to do or say certain things. So that the more, what I'm saying here is similar to what I think Frederick Lordon has said. He says, when Lordon makes the argument that the ideal of modern capital is this kind of ideal of do what you love for your living and you'll never have to work a day in your life. The idea of the sort of Silicon Valley entrepreneur, of one who finds not just material benefit from work, but wants to work all the time because work is the most engaging and interesting thing that they do. And the more that capital tries to promise, not just you'll make money doing this, but you'll find purpose and meaning, the more it risks playing with a certain kind of fire. Because when people find that there isn't that meaning there, and as we were talking about a few minutes ago, the so-called Great Resignation, people leaving jobs in droves during the pandemic because they found out that they were seen as expendable, as interchangeable. The more you try to find meaning, the more you risk people becoming quite indignant when they realize there is no meaning. In the same way, I would argue that the more capital presents itself as, or capitalists present themselves as, these kinds of larger than life, workers who work hardest and work smartest and produce their wealth that way, the more they expose themselves to a kind of, emperor's new clothes kind of moment. The more they're out and exposed in public, the more we see, hey, these people are not they're not the smartest people in the room. They just have great reservoirs of wealth to draw from. So the more that capitalism denaturalizes itself in order to mythologize the capitalist, the more it exposes itself to new kinds of indignation. Although I think it's important to point out that, and this is one of the things I was trying to stress, or I've been trying to stress and think about the affective dimension, is that it's not enough to just, this is the difficult thing. There are plenty of people who are disillusioned with the existing system. That's not sufficient. People have to also believe in the capacity to do something differently, and to be able to organize with others in order for that to happen. And I think that right now, I think the sort of overall gamble that capitalist countries throughout the world are kind of toying with is how much disillusion can you govern with? How much sense of decreased possibility, potentiality, of just a sense that, like, I guess this is the best we could do. I guess life just sort of sucks. How much of that can function as a reigning kind of affective composition?
you, Jason. I will again ask our audience if there is any extra questions. It's almost 10 p.m. here, so I suppose that people are a bit tired and ready to go to sleep, but yeah, I'll wait for a few seconds. If that's all, oh, there is Martin.
Yeah, I mean, let's not waste the opportunity.
Of course.
If nobody is eager, I mean, maybe if we can steer a bit from the main topic of this lecture, and like maybe back to the concretely the workplace, the world of work, how people like experience it. Jason, you mentioned a few times, if I'm not mistaken, this dull compulsion of economic relations, and I mean that is certainly an indispensable factor for capital accumulation. You need people who are disconnected from the means of production, or by extension the means of their reproduction. But if we look at the situation of the economic compulsions, this dull compulsion of economic relations gets people to their place of work. They need a wage, and they're there. But their pace of work, their intensity of work, their productivity is something that is governed from the side of capital. The capital is interested in the socially necessary labor time. So not just that the people are at their place of work, but that they are working at a pace that will make their firm competitive on the market and all of that. So basically, what stems from that is a need for a certain degree of interpersonal, basically violence. You know, you need to have some sort of managerial compulsion, but to make the workers work at the pace that the capital and managers seem fit, and that could be done in many ways. Sometimes it's like in the Bangladeshi textile factories, it's done through the rape of textile the workers, or the threat of rape. So maybe if you can go a little bit on that, like tangent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, that one of the problems is of capital is that, you know, fear of losing one's job, losing one's, you know, shelter, losing, you know, other basic necessities, gets people to show up, but it doesn't get that much more, right? It doesn't produce what Frederic Lordon calls the collinearization, the workers striving, matching the companies striving. And as Lordon also argues, that becomes more important in an economy which is more dependent upon things like emotional labor, on people being able to perform services as well as produce goods, right? Because it doesn't matter if someone shows up, you know, to a Ford automobile factory and they're glumly or bitterly, you know, doing whatever it is their part. Doesn't really matter as long as they do it at the fast enough speed, and the machine will take, the assembly line speed will take care of the fast enough speed. Whether they're angry or happy doesn't really register on any level. But someone whose job it is to, you know, show up in a call center, or you know, to make phone calls, to make sales, or do other forms of service type labor, how they feel and how they interact is increasingly important to how well the company functions. So you need a maximum sort of orientation, and in order to do that, you know, it's hard to do that without offering people the promise of some kind of, you know, future, And when that becomes difficult, it becomes difficult to motivate. And I think that's, I mean, one of the things that's come out in the exodus from certain forms of service labor that happened during the COVID pandemic is that, of course, these people who left, they still needed to work. I mean, the little amount of money that was given to get people through the shutdown didn't last at all. I mean, we still have in the US, we still have people don't have to pay back their student loans, and that's significant. But by and large, people still need money. But people left their jobs and in some sense in many cases tried to figure out ways that they could, you know, um, sell things online or figure out ways to kind of do other, kind of entrepreneurial dreams, and whether or not these succeeded or failed remains to be seen. But I think it is one of the fundamental problems of that I think we're seeing capital confront is that on the one hand, decreasing profitability and so on demands to sweat more out of workers, but at the same time, because the nature of the kind of work that is done, capital demands that those workers smile while they're sweating. And that is a real impasse. And I think we did see some rumblings of that impasse in and through the COVID period. Whether or not those rumblings will continue, I think, remains to be seen. And that's what I was trying to allude to in the last part when I said that work is both the thing that ties us to capital, it ties us both materially, and it ties us in terms of our ideological and affective orientations, but it's also the thing that constantly risks the possibility of breaking that tie, because work can never be what it is sold to us on an ideological level. It just can't, because human beings get exhausted, get worn out. We remain both the necessary commodity to capital's functioning and that makes it possible. And as you say, in the division in between necessary and surplus labor, that's possible through the selling of labor power. But there is in that also the ever-present possibility of a rupture because of the fact that when human beings sell their labor power, it's unlike any other commodity. They have to endure whatever the buyer puts them through.
I think these were great concluding remarks, not just for this lecture, but for in general. Thank you, Jason. For the other members of our Zoom online talk, I would like to wish them good night and thank you for joining us this evening and being part of this online talk with Jason about the negative solidarity and the transformation of the work, especially with the reference to the latest historical developments.